Good evening. To say that we are living in unusual times would be an understatement. Yes, we are plagued by a plague. But this is nothing new in the world, and despite it being very new for us, there is, Be'ezras Hashem, with God's help, every expectation that this will eventually subside, either through new discoveries of new drugs and vaccines, or maybe, and halavai, just by sheer quiescence. But when I say we're living in unusual times, I refer to something very different indeed. You see, this week's parsha begins with a very famous verse, which is interpreted in an unusual but familiar way to us in the Talmud. And as I recite the verse, please notice four distinct qualities which are mentioned. Ve'escha legoy gadol, va'avarechecha, ve'agadla shemecha, Veheye bracha. And I shall make thee, God tells Abraham, a great nation, and I shall bless thee, and increase your fame, and it shall be for a blessing. Rashi, on this verse, quotes the very famous passage in Tractate Psachim, which interprets the entire verse as referring to the beginning of the Shmona Esrei, the Amidah prayer, which we recite 3 times a day. And I shall make you a great nation. This refers to the mention of your name, Avraham, Elokei Avraham. I shall bless you. This refers to the recital of the phrase Elokei Yitzchak. And finally, I shall increase your fame. This refers to your grandson, Elokei Yaakov. Then the Medrash takes an unusual turn and says as follows: lest you think that the blessings will conclude with the names of your descendants, or perhaps even all of your names together, this is not the case. The fourth phrase, and you shall be for a blessing, this refers to the conclusion, the seal of the blessing, and that will only be with the name of Avraham, Abraham. As we indeed see, the end of the first blessing is Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avraham. Now, the question which this medrash implies is that it gives a false impression. Is Abraham, God forbid, an egotist? Don't worry, Abraham, the blessing won't end with your son or your grandson, but only with you. What? We know this is actually quoted in the Avos de Rabbi Nassim, that it is natural for fathers never to be jealous of their children. Neither are teachers to be jealous of their students. So what does this mean? Don't worry, it's going to end with you, Abraham. So fortunately, the famed Rabbi Menachem Mendel Morgenstern, otherwise known as the Kotzker Rebbe, addresses this very question. He tells us that what the Medrash is referring to is not the actual personalities of our ancestors, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, but rather in the Shmona Esrei they refer to the qualities which they represent. Avraham Avinu is the representative of Gemilut Chasadim par excellence. He graciously taught tens of thousands of people in his generation the basics of morality, belief in God, monotheism. He was willing to pray for the wicked people of Sodom. He refused profit from the battle of the 5 kings. And he took in Hagar, an Egyptian princess, who begged him that she should live in the house of Abraham. And he brought her into his household. Yitzchak, he represents prayer, which traditionally is equated with sacrifice. Indeed, Isaac was actually willing to become a sacrifice in his own person at the binding of Isaac. When Rebekah is brought to him from far away Padan Aram, she finds Yitzchak praying in the field, Lasuach basadeh. So Isaac is about prayer. Finally, Yaakov Avinu. He is the primary representative of Torah study. He became known as the Ish Ohalim, the man who spent his life in the tents of Torah. And he succeeded in bringing the sanctity and the values of the Torah into his professional life, while tending the flocks of Laban as well. It is to these 3 principles of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim that the Kotzker Rebbe tells us are the 3 pillars which are mentioned in the famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, that the world relies on 3 pillars, al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed, al ha'torah, al ha'avodah, va'al gemilut chasadim. And that is all repeated in the first paragraph of the Shmona Esrei. But wait a minute, didn't we say there are 4 qualities? What is the 4th? And what of the enigmatic ending, Magen Avraham, God promising Abraham, it will end with your name? What is so special about the quality of Gemilut Chasadim, which Abraham represents? Why does that 3rd quality override the others, as it is considered a quality in its own right, a number 4, the seal of the other 2? My beloved uncle, Rabbi Norman Lamb, of blessed memory, suggested that all 3 practices, Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim, are of course good and essential for the existence of the world, and yet they are not enough. All of them require that seal, that 4th ingredient, Gemilut Chasadim, in repetition. In order to be performed effectively, it is not sufficient to pray, study, or even practice acts of loving kindness, Gemilut Chasadim. They must all be performed through the prism of Gemilut Chasadim, making it a 4th category. Davening must not just be davened up. It has to be recited warmly, cheerfully, with music, with pathos, not mechanically. It has to be recited with Gemilut Chasadim, or stated simply, Magen Avraham, the seal of Abraham, Gemilut Chasadim. Torah study must also be Torat Shel Chesed. When King Solomon declared in the famous Eshes Chayil, which we recite every Friday night, that Torat Chesed al Lishonah, the Torah of kindness, is upon the woman of valor's lips, the Gemara explains that Torah must be engaging in others in a spirit of generosity, and with taking into consideration the feelings and the various spiritual levels of the person who comes to ask a question about the Torah. You see, halacha must never be dispensed in an authoritarian manner, but rather with grace, with charm, with sensitivity. In short, with Magen Avraham. So it is with prayer, so it is with Torah study, and finally, so it is with Gemilut Chasadim itself. You see, Gemilut Chasadim must also be dispensed with Gemilut Chasadim. It is possible, for example, to dispense charity, tzedakah, to the poor, nourishing the body of that poor person, but spiritually robbing him of his dignity, of his pride, self-esteem, of his very humanity. Tzedakah given coarsely in this manner is better not to be given at all. It has to be given with understanding and with good cheer toward the recipient. Chesed, loving kindness, also requires Magen Avraham. I believe this message needs to be shared with the world entire. America, as we all know, was created on the principle that all men are created equal, which minimally translates as all people, all human beings, are entitled to respect and dignity, even if we don't always agree with each other. Before the founding of this wonderful country, the differences between men were resolved in one way, through the guillotine, through the fusillade, the sword. Our great country introduced an executive branch, a legislative, judicial, which had built-in checks and balances, ensuring that differences could be resolved amicably and respectfully, and most importantly, through that cherished institute of them all called compromise. America shined as a beacon to the rest of the world and inspired them to emulate us. But something has happened. Today, our country seems split in two, our differences irreconcilable. We seem almost at the verge, God forbid, of another civil war. How did this happen? I believe it's because somewhere down the road in this country, we lost our Magen Avraham, our Gemilut Chasadim, our loving kindness. Generosity of spirit precludes anger, media circuses, lashon hara, cynicism, and hubris. Opinions need to be formulated in terms of and with respect to other conflicting values, with balance and chesed. If we choose one value over all else, positive as that value may be, we end up becoming extremists, not willing to listen to anybody else, to weigh one value against another, balancing them. And we do this often to disastrous consequence. Having learned this and applying it in practice, we shall be able to return to the Ribbono Shel Olam and ask him not only to be a Gomel Chasadim to us, but a Gomel Chasadim Tovim, as we recite in the Shemona Esrei, that his kindness toward us be expressed with Gemilut Chasadim, graciousness, warmth, and affection. That he grant the entire world the ultimate kindness of bringing us Mashiach Tzidkenu, and an end to all the hatred and violence, and that pernicious hatred of them all, anti-Semitism. And may we be worthy of beginning a new world of Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael. Shabbat Shalom.